this sort of lost world that precedes ours, that gave rise to the digital computer, this machine that really uplifts symbolic abstraction to new heights, is predicated on the work of people that were really in these scientific, logical ideas with their hands and their bodies. Bush talked about, I think at one point he says something like, he talked about a barnyard understanding of engineering, right? Of like, that's how he really wanted people to learn. He's like, yeah, the math is fine, the symbolics is fine, but this was a culture that really treasured thinking graphically and then also thinking with objects and systems that people can manipulate. I came across reading the work of this historian, Larry Owens, who talks about the engineering culture that produced Bush and how graphics were so important to them. And I think about that a lot now, actually, with how I have my wife and I have friends whose grandfathers were draftsmen, people who, for a living, they produced the technical illustrations that so much of the world needed. And that is a category of labor that has disappeared. But we still have more graphics in a sense than ever before. The ease with which we can create computer graphics and how graphics are integrated to other tools that we use on computers means that many more people can produce graphics. You do not need a specialist. That labor has been reorganized. And I just think about the loss of that graphical skill. It is not as prevalent now as it was back then. But that, to me, is a very interesting example of that turn towards abstraction.
Welcome back after our summer sabbatical to Humans on the Loop, episode 23 of the show that explores wisdom in an age of magical technologies. I'm your host, Michael Garfield, and this week I'm talking to Chaim Gingold, one of the creators of the game Spore, along with the legendary Will Wright of SimCity fame. And we're talking about his book, Building SimCity: How to Put the World in a Machine, published by MIT Press, one of the most fascinating and comprehensive histories of computing, and specifically of simulation, available in the world today. Chaim has spent his life creating new games and toys, someone who has thought deeply about our relationship to software and hardware, and reading Building SimCity helped me understand something very fundamental about human thought. Thinking depends on abstraction. Our ability to detect patterns, to form categories, to derive analogies, relies on a kind of constant statistical association, aggregation of information, and the production of groups of things that we use to reduce uncertainty and navigate constantly evolving environments. So we rely on abstraction. And at the same time, anyone who's been listening to this show for a while knows that we are running serious risks right now of being too deeply embedded in our abstractions. Bigotry and stereotyping are obvious examples. Making claims about what is without communicating the underlying process by which we decided on the rules of these advanced biological simulations we inhabit leads to conflict between differing worldviews, cognitive dissonance between different versions of identity that we hold within ourselves. And then there's the problem of the appropriate level of abstraction. How much detail is necessary in order to understand the mechanistic relationships between things? All of us are guilty at some point of, as James C. Scott put it, seeing like a state, of mistaking our categories for the things themselves, and then operating on only a very thin slice of the actual world. In our technologically advanced era, it's not so simple to say the map is not the territory, because the maps we produce increasingly constrain and determine our behavior. So the matter of simulation, the way that we choose details for our maps, what those details belie about the assumptions we're making, about the worlds that we inhabit and create, are not just questions of art, they are existential concerns in an age of exponential artificial intelligence and the self-fulfilling prophecies of our increasing technological leverage. Humans on the Loop is ultimately about how the means that we have at our disposal can assist in this, and about the urgent need for us to engage in better introspection about what we want, where those desires come from, and what is worth wanting. And of course, can we want better? Can we imagine better? Chaim's book explores how the success of SimCity was predicated on the fact that it was less a game with concrete terminal win conditions and more a toy that invited the creativity and exploration of its users. And it was a pleasure to talk with him about how we can use his historical review as a case study for thinking about how the challenges that we face in this century might be better met through thinking in terms of game design and the timeless art of play. These were the concerns on my mind last month at the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where I gave a 10-minute talk on foraging in high-dimensional data, thinking about how complex systems and game design can inform a healthier relationship to technology, and specifically to the interfaces that we use to engage with the vast and mysterious technological world. I also recommend my recent Aeon magazine feature essay, Are Humans Destined to Evolve into Crabs?, which is, of course, ridiculous, but explores these issues through an evolutionary framework. And obviously, this wonderful book, Building SimCity, you can find a link to buy it in the show notes to this episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Chaim is a fascinating person, very deeply researched. If it sparks something in you, please do the like, subscribe dance, follow me on Substack, and consider joining other members for our regular hangouts, which resume in 2 weeks, where we'll explore exploration, the built environment, and how we can make the internet a more playful and creative place. Thanks so much for listening, and enjoy. Let's try to swallow the whale of this.
I've got more on the MAXIS. I have done more thinking about the MAXIS postmortem recently. So I think that I just read The New Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order by Gary Gersel, and that's helped me put some more perspective on it.
Well, yeah, again, like for folks who are watching the book, took me weeks to read. I highlighted half of it, and I feel like even addressing the full scope of the stuff that you brought up here would take like a Lex Friedman 7-hour marathon thing where we're all like peeing into a catheter in our astronaut suits below the desk or whatever. But I think that if the goal is just to sell this book, which is a goal for me here because it's marvelous and should be taught in school, then we can do that in 90 minutes. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So yeah, Building SimCity is one of these books that like you are peeling off the surface of everything you thought you knew and realizing it's all connected underground. It was like, for people who are into like Adam Curtis documentaries, that same conspiratorial web map satisfaction, but in a way that I found to be very careful in its claims and very patient and deliberate and methodical with the reader to put everything together in a way that really lays out just how prevalent simulation is in our society and how deep it goes and how many assumptions we're standing on when we think about our world. So just hyped. Where I would love to start with you, though, just as a way of introducing you before we dive into idea land, is for you to tell everybody who you are and why you care about this stuff, why this was a dissertation topic, your professional history, but even deeper, like therapy session, like who are you? Where did these interests come from? What is behind them and motivating them in your life?
Yeah, that may be the hardest question. Let's see. So yeah, identify as a game designer. I have a background in computer science and game design, and gosh, I don't know where to start with the history of myself and how I come to this. I guess I've been obsessed with computing and computers and simulation and games since I was little, and at some point I went back to school to do a PhD in computer science, and I wanted to write about the history of games, and SimCity had been open sourced, and that was made it an enticing target, the original SimCity. And I had worked with Will Wright, the creator of SimCity, who I think is like a really fascinating individual. And the more I just kind of kept pulling on this thread, the more there was there. And in a sense, I think about this book project as an obsession that would not die, in order for this obsession to sort of be resolved, I needed to complete this project. And part of it was like there's this thing that mesmerized me, and it was almost like I was trying to like work through like a fever, like why is this fascinating? And the more that I dug into the why is this fascinating for me and for others, became this, as you say, this sort of subterranean exploration of all of this web of topics. And sort of it was like, and so the more that I dug, it was like, oh, there's even more roots here that connect to these other roots. And yeah, I don't know. That's the.
When did you decide you wanted to become a game designer?
I think that. I mean, on the one hand, I think we're all game designers. I think all kids like make games. I think I remember being like a kid with my siblings, like making hypercard games, just because that's what you did with computers, basic games, which is what basic, in many senses, was created for. Professionally, I think I wanted to do it at some point, and then when I was probably a teenager, and then I think I lost interest in that. And then when the opportunity came up when I was in my early 20s, and I was doing a master's degree at Georgia Tech to intern with Will Wright at MAXIS on his new project Spore, I was very excited about that. So I was like, that's a very cool opportunity. I was a little bit skeptical. I was like, is this real? I was like, is this really real? Am I really going to get to work with Will? And the answer was yes, I did. And it was amazing. And I think that there's a lot of games that I find uninteresting. I don't play a lot of games that anymore, but I still play some. But I want something that's kind of weird and novel. And so the Will Wright works, so the SimCity, SimEarth, the sort of friends, like SimLife, like those things really interested me. So I was interested in these weirder things. So Spore was an interesting game to work on. Like Call of Duty would not be an interesting game for me to work on. But weird simulation games that deal with subjects of interest that are beyond just the sort of intercultural world of games, like that really interested me.
So actually if we're going to start in the macrocosm of childhood and why simulation-based games occupy, as you say a few times, one of my favorite words, the liminality, not quite a toy, not quite a game, I think is really interesting. And so this is good because I feel like talk about Doreen Gary Nelson, her work in city simulation with physical materials in the classroom environment and how that differed from what Will Wright built with SimCity. And I think that this is going to be a major theme I want to prosecute in our conversation about what James P. Karsh calls finite and infinite games, point to a number of theorists who make the distinction between gaming and play. And so we're skipping kind of to the end of your book here, but I would love to hear you go into a bit about this, because I think, just to situate it for my interest in this, is that I regard when I'm thinking about this show as a way of helping people develop a sense of curiosity and play about engagement with artificial intelligence. Part of that is getting people out of the mindset of regarding something like ChatGPT as a productivity enhancement in which people win a finite game of success and status in society, and into a state of fuck around and find out, where you see, as you say towards the end of the book, that players, according to Will Wright, are a designer's most important resource. Designers do not shape electronic computers as much as they sway and stoke player imagination. And you point to the way that, for instance, John Conway with The Game of Life leveraged an enormous reader audience with Scientific American to get people to mess around with cellular automata on their PCs. And so there's this thing about, for instance, the recent trend. I saw that like a bunch of people are trying to get ChatGPT to say David Mayer, and it won't, and no one can figure out why. And so everyone's trying to like jailbreak ChatGPT to say the words David Mayer. And so for me, this is a way more interesting way of relating to.
It's like a Truman Show kind of experience for us. It's
Yeah,
like,
it's
whoa,
like,
this thing does not exist in this simulation.
right,
Why?
right. And yeah, so that's one of the characteristics of this kind of game that you and I and so many other people find interesting, which is parameterizing it and trying to break it and trying to figure out the failure modes or how to do weird stuff that the programmer didn't intend. And so, yeah, play versus games is where I would love to hear you start to.
I love the chat GPT connection because that was like, for me to go from ChatGPT being very skeptical of LLMs to being an enthusiastic user of them, it was all about finding that playful orientation, which I think is an idea that I got from Ethan Mollick, I think, where you say you just got to, I don't know if he actually uses the sense of play, but it was that sense of you just got to play around with this and see I was like, I need to bring this a childlike frame to this. So playing games. So I really wanted to frame SimCity and other open-ended simulation things as play and not game. And part of that was that if you think about them, sort of games, like depending on which definition you go by, games are these more things that something like SimCity is a liminal game. It does not quite a game. If you look at Jesper Juhl, a game theorist, definition of games, he says SimCity you cannot win or lose it. In games, he says have to have win or lose conditions. There's got to have because that finite game. There's a boundary, there's a clear outcome. SimCity does not do that. SimCity you get to do whatever you want, and the game. I'm going to use the word game, but I try not to in the book. But SimCity is a plaything. Doesn't tell you whether you've won or you lost. It gives you a lot of rich feedback, and you decide. So I wanted to reground. I wanted to find a grounding for discussing it and its cousins as play. And so I spent a lot of time in the play theory, which is super fascinating space that gets to the philosophical. It touches on like scientists studying children playing, and it touches on theology and all kinds of different subjects. And my perspective that I came to is that I think about play as a more general category, and it seems like increasingly different kinds of animals we now know play. It used to be thought that like turtles didn't play and bees didn't play, but I think in the last year or two, there's this fascinating paper that came out talking about how bees play. And you can see these videos of a bee playground, basically the scientists made where they're like, well, see, the bees chose to go push these balls around in this little bee playground, even though it serves no purpose for them. They choose to do this behavior, and it fits the philosophical definition of play they've set up. So play is something we all do, many animals seem to do. And I think of games I subscribe to the theory of games as a sort of subgenre of play in which the rules are like ossified. And I like this one theorist describes it as games as social objects. They're sort of these like things that have sort of play that sort of settled down. And you look at play theorist Brian Sutton Smith, one of the most influential play scholars of the 20th century. He talks about play as so it's inherently unstable. The rules change. The play can fall apart at any moment because play is all about inversion. So the rules can be inverted. It's unstable. So games sort of can create this container for holding play and containing it. It's like a playground with walls, even though playground is still play. And so play in that sense is not necessarily it's a place about, and Sutton Smith talks about play as being, it can be educational or uplifting, or it can be dark. It can be about power. It can be about domination. So play, he has a less romantic, let's say, sense. His sense of play encompasses the romantic, but beyond.
And then you say of games, quoting Will Wright, tend to be isolated universes where there's a rule set, and once you leave that universe, the rule set is meaningless. I keep thinking about this in connection to something you said just prior to this in the book, that Will Wright actually had a problem trying to sell this, that originally he was trying to work it out with Broderbund, and everything at the time was war games, which makes sense. And because in a little bit, I want to get into with you the history of computation in the military industrial sense, where Vannevar Bush and all of that. But war games, there's the clear concrete goal. And again, like the finite game or the classically defined game is The big one that everyone I talk to on this show recognizes in some sense as not all encompassing, but we are forced to play is the game of finance, is the game of economic success. Like you have to play this game. You have to assume the persona that like goes into the office or sits there on the Zoom call like I am not a cat. And the issue that he keeps coming up against first in before MAXIS even exists, and then later when MAXIS is opened up for public offering and suddenly has to answer to investors. SimCity is not a win-lose thing, but then the productive activity of this game studio is now answerable to the win-lose conditions of the market. Like so the big question here about simulation, before we really get into your philosophy of simulation, is of the way in which we get lost in that simulation, where we forget that there's a world outside of the symbolic abstractions of money and status, and how this interferes with the attempts throughout computer history by people like Alan Kay and many other educators to create open-ended learning environments that are directed by or the learner and are not like standardized testing. They're not answerable to these goals that are, it's like and so we get distorted. As you say, abstraction is both the crown jewel of computing and its grotesque deformity. So yeah, I would love to hear from you about how this theme shows up again and again in the relationship between the development of computation and of computer games and of the explosive success of computer games in the market, and the way that has like changed affordances by which we understand what we're doing as people in society. It's like a real big theme here in your book.
One of the things that I was surprised by when I was digging into the history of computing was just how often play and games, playfulness even, just playfulness shows up as a theme throughout the history of computing. And Space War, there's a Game of Life, as you mentioned, is a very well-known example of a computational pastime, leisure activity, playful endeavor people engaged in. And then there was, of course, Space War before that. And it shows up again, even like Whirlwind, one of the first interactive digital graphical computers, I think the first. There was like this, they had a little bouncing ball game that they made for it. They made little sound effects. And so it's just, and this is not just people blowing off steam or sort of getting their yayas out. It's also these playful, they also end up being sort of serving instrumental purposes as well. So Space War was made for people made it, these hackers made Space War to sort of show off and explore what the computer can do and play. But then Space War became distributed by DEC at one point, the computer company, as a way to test their hardware, to test their computers and demo their computers, right? So there's this kind of, they feed each other. So there's the sort of, whether something is instrumentalized or not, they both seem to, there's this dialectic between them that goes through the history of computing. And I think the thing with Will Wright, so with MAXIS and Will Wright and MAXIS as a business venture is super interesting, because Will is someone who definitely, I think that he is able to produce what he creates because he is not focused on winning that finite game of making money, right? He just follows his interests. And sometimes those interests that he follows become products that a lot of people want. As in the case of SimCity and The Sims, but they need to still be yoked to some commercial, more finite sort of entrepreneurial energy to come to market, which is what you see here, right? Broderbund did not want SimCity. Broderbund made Print Shop. They made things that were not games. I think that it was the liminality of SimCity. They were like, well, it looks and feels like a game. We know you as a game developer from your last game that we published, but I don't know. You should be able to win or lose this thing. And they passed on it. And Will didn't want to compromise on that. And then you see it once MAXIS takes on investment, they get more oversight. And so it's like there's this tension at the company that eventually pulls it apart, is what I argue, but also enables it to create these amazing things along the way.
One of the characteristics of play that you mention is you're safe to fail. And earlier on, when you talk about Will Wright and Alan Kay having a very different attitude toward failure, that something more common, software engineers, precisely because they're working with these abstract symbolic systems and you have to play around and see how alterations to the code affect the way the program actually runs, is that people who learn to code are comfortable with failure in a way, but it's like, it seems to be because you are afforded an opportunity to iterate, because you're not really making those edits to the source code in real time in ways that affect your own ability to survive in the world. And that this is the big difference. Like, this is the difference between what it means to engage as if you are going to work to feed your kids and then just going to work to feed your kids. And so there's a big question in this show that keeps coming up, is one of how it is that we can inculcate in people, if we assume fear and curiosity as poles along a gradient. Evolution, as you mentioned, has more or less ubiquitously figured out that we need some sort of learning period in animal development. And there are, at the level of populations or ecosystems, the ability of systems to respond to novel stimuli and situations outside of the training data of genetic inheritance has to involve something that looks to anyone trying to assign purpose to activity as though it's inefficient or noisy. And so there's what I see as ultimately a scalar here between what play is doing instrumentally on evolutionary timescales and what it appears to be doing at the timescale of the classically defined individual. And so the question that keeps coming up is, again, how might we, in a kind of biomimetic way, acknowledge this and intentionally start to encode that designoid intelligence into our social structures and our educational systems, knowing that over longer timescales, this is actually what works. And so I'm just thinking through this book about, there are reasons that simulation has become such a popular genre of software. And you talk at length about why SimCity was so successful, again, why Conway's Game of Life was so successful. And I wonder if you can abstract from that into some sort of protocol for threading this particular needle in the design of social systems.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think part of what something like SimCity or Conway's Game of Life do is they give people permission to play. It's that's part of what we need, is that sense of invitation and comfort. So it's, you can relax a little bit. You don't have to worry about winning some finite game, not looking foolish in front of your peers, not putting something at risk. So I wonder about, yeah, that's interesting. There's this rise in simulation that we, of course, with computers, we have more computers, you have more simulation power in a sense, though, of course, as Will Wright points out, the ultimate simulations that we have are the ones in our minds. That's the ultimate simulation resource that we have. So how do you engender more sort of, it's almost like, I feel like what you're asking is, how do you engender more playfulness in our social systems, more sort of imaginative, exploratory play. I think about what my son does. He's just always getting into stuff, and he's just really eager to see what happens, even if it might kill him. But luckily I'm there to catch him. So he has that, he doesn't need to worry about it so much, even if, I don't know if he can.
I guess that is it. It's, if you think about, again, financial investment, the people who seem to do best as investors are the people who are wealthy enough to be able to take the risk. And so, in a sense, really what I'm asking you is to answer a wicked problem question. How can we think better the baseline of human flourishing so that people can step out a limb without as much of a concern, even in like anyone who's in a like married, I think, or in some sort of long-term relationship can observe the ways that something, in my case, like something really changed between my partner and I when we had kids. And suddenly the stakes felt so much greater. And
Yeah.
something shifted in us as people. And like part of that is natural and understandable. And part of that is you get to this point where it becomes, it's like equivalent to scaling laws and the way that, in a similar way to MAXIS, Ed Catmull's history of Pixar talks about when Pixar was acquired by Disney and they had to come in and save Disney Animation because everyone at Disney Animation had a history that they had to honor, and they were trying to reproduce what had worked under Walt Disney. And Pixar had to come in there, shake things up, and show them to great success. This is how we've had 14 number one films in a row, and you guys haven't had a number one movie in 16 years. There's a counterintuitive thing that you bring up in complex systems that actually success requires some sort of rebalancing of that risk portfolio.
And it's probably a good example you're bringing up too, because it's not as if the artists and animators at Disney weren't, I'm sure they were very playful people. It probably really meant engendering a sort of the right playful exploratory orientation organizationally, managerially, that enabled that to create the right circumstances for that to come out. Yeah, I'm also thinking, as you're talking, I'm also thinking about dark play, and especially the finance example, and thinking about the way that something can be playful for one individual, but it can not be playful for somebody else. Like I think about a cat playing with a mouse. The cat may be playing, but not the mouse. And I think about that sort of there's a kind of power dynamics of play there too. So perhaps for some villainized financier here that we're imagining, they may be having a great time playing around with some market, and there may be a lot of people at the other end of it who are not having a particularly good time with someone else's play. So part of this is about, when I think about this socially, what does that mean? How do we foster, sort of non-dark play, the simple way of putting it.
Well, it's funny. I'm really glad that you brought that up, the cat and mouse, because I was looking for this passage I just found, thankfully, about the early days of BASIC, where you say that the developers of BASIC invited students to work on self-directed projects that interested them, believing that this would motivate learning. The computer would be democratized, not cloistered, the same way that libraries make knowledge broadly accessible. As in a library, students had privacy, license to pursue knowledge and activities without anyone looking over their shoulder. And so I think that you're right, like that there is a sense in which the real issue now is that everyone knows that they're being watched and measured against something. Like when I did the work at Mozilla last year, studying convergent aspects of innovation across tech companies, the thing that kept coming up in your history of MAXIS is like the golden age of innovation at Bell Labs ended when they were divested, and suddenly the managers were paying much more careful attention to what was going on in the innovation hubs. And, it's funny that you bring up that when MAXIS was eventually sold to Electronic Arts, that suddenly in a larger corporation where the success of the entire games company had less riding on the personal success of Will Wright, he was finally able to finish this benighted decadal process that actually became The Sims and earned over $5 billion, which, if I did the math right, is more than MAXIS ever made. And so it's like when I talk to my buddies at Google or at Oxford, they talk about there's something that happens in a very large society, or like the way that people moving into New York at the turn of the 20th century. He talked about the anonymity of large urban spaces and how it allowed you to reinvent yourself. I don't know.
I think part of what we're pointing at is that it requires a certain level of wealth and resources to be comfortable enough to play. If you're worried about your next meal, worried about your next product all the time, it's like that pressure can be hard. And I think about also the circumstances of Will Wright's life that enabled him. Like, he had the financial flexibility to experiment in his 20s and then later throughout his career and not really worry about, as far as I can tell, as far as I from my research, to not really worry about, have the flexibility to play around. And that's in Bell Labs when they were part of Mama Bell. It was like, it's like Google. They just had a lot of resources, a lot of place to play around. And when the company was broken up, a lot more scrutiny came on those researchers. Presumably is what happened there. And of course the culture changed too.
I want to switch topics here. You spend a huge chunk of this book talking about the history of computation from World War II into the 80s, and actually even further back, like all the way back to Gottfried Leibniz and others who were theorizing something we would recognize as computation well before there were any machines available to assist in this. And you say some really nuanced things about the relationship between the analog and the digital that I think matter here. If we are to, one of the goals for me with this show is frankly to take the piss out of a kind of eschatological, effective accelerationist transhumanism, this idea that we're going to escape the material conditions of our lives. And this book being such a careful study of the materiality of software and the sociality of software. Just as I asked you to get into your own personal biography, I would love to hear you lay out where you identify in Bush and von Neumann and the others, the origins of this and the origins of software, and how we move from like concrete analogs to these abstract symbolic manipulations would be something we have not discussed on this show, and I think I would love to hear you riff on.
Let me think. I'm just trying to think, where's the right place to enter this through, sort of. I was just fascinated by these computing machines that existed before the digital. They weren't called computers. So you sort of look at these sort of World War II is really marks the beginning of, and the end of World War II, the beginning of what we call what computer historians call modern computers, these digital programmable machines. And there were all kinds of, like, the history of computing is not simple. Like, there's this cartoon of it. We think of, there's analog computers, then there's digital computers. And like an asteroid comes and wipes out all the analog machines, then we have digital machines. And that's kind of how I thought about it, I think, before I got into computing history. And then you look at historians of technology and they point out, no, it's actually far more nuanced. Analog and digital machines coexisted for many years. It's a little bit like the transition we're seeing now to electric vehicles. It's not like all of us, one day, like our grandkids might think about how they were gas cars and now they're all electric cars or whatever. But actually there's hybrids, there's all these weird hybrid cars, there's like this, and there's like all things, these technologies are coexisting. People still ride horses, some for transportation in some parts of the world, but largely for leisure activity, right? Nowadays in the wealthy industrialized West. So the analog devices and that culture, actually the culture in particular too, and the ideas, I really got interested in that. I stumbled across a reference to one of Bush's lectures I think someone had misquoted him, and I sort of dug into the original paper, and it kind of blew my mind because he was using the word proportional to describe the relationship of a model to a simulated thing. And so before World War II, Bush was actually a leader. He's well known, and if you're a digital media trained with a digital media background, you learn about Bush primarily through the MEMX, right? This thing, the forerunner considered to be a forerunner of hypertext and the internet, inspired a lot of ideas around hypertext. And the MEMX was Bush's concept that he came up with during the World War II, where you would have this, it was a kind of science fictional, he was imagining, but using the technology of the time, like microfiche and so on. You'd have this desk that had all of your papers and books available that could just be brought up quickly, and you could establish links between them and these associative trails, I think he called them, and navigate through different subjects. And I realized that Bush had this whole line of analog instruments, analytical instruments, I think is what he called them often, that he developed before then. And they were very much about simulation. And so he and his colleagues built models of power grids. And of course, we know about, what do they put the airplanes in? The flight simulator, there's the wind tunnels we put miniature planes in, and the tow tanks for boats. And so they built all these models, and the analog was the animating idea. And they really thought about them in terms of analogy. And it was sort of now, and I was interested in this in part because we think now of analog as being material as opposed to immaterial. And this is a very problematic dichotomy, is what I realized. It's just, first of all, what we have now, as we were talking about before we started recording, was that things that we think of as immaterial are actually quite material, right? Like your iPhone seems super powerful, and it is a powerful computer, but part of what makes it so powerful is all that vast infrastructure, data centers that sit behind it, right? That enable you to search and so on. So we think about analog as being material as opposed to immaterial, but it's not at all the case. And I was looking at how the concept of analogy is like, the analogy is what makes it work, is what made those simulations work. And you look at early writing about digital computers, and it's really about analogy as well. And so it's not about discrete versus continuous or physical versus immaterial. That what I argue is that it's really about this principle of analogy, using one system to represent another. And that's one of the through lines.
One of the things I found most interesting about Vannevar Bush and the differential analyzer was the way that it connects to this larger issue of multiple representations and the ability of softwares and symbolic systems generally to afford cross-domain communication and collective thinking. You say Bush marveled that one of the most attractive aspects of the machine is that through experience, one acquires an entirely new appreciation of the innate nature of a differential equation. Formal mathematics will become a live thing. Bush told a story about the differential analyzer's head mechanic who had only a high school education. In building and managing the analyzer, he came to know the fundamentals of calculus, help professors operate and troubleshoot the machine. Bush observed that he had learned the calculus in mechanical terms. He had it under his skin. How did this happen? And then on the next page, you say, quoting James Clerk Maxwell in 1870, scientific truth should be presented in different forms and should be regarded as equally scientific, whether it appears in the robust form and the vivid coloring of a physical illustration or in the tenuity and paleness of a symbolical expression. Multiple representations welcome diverse minds. This shows up again and again in the ways that you render the various educational innovations here, that there is something that people keep trying to do with advances in technology, which is to make knowledge more accessible, make it more democratic, invite a broader collective intelligence. And then you, a couple times in this book, talk about how computer programming started as the first 6 computer programmers in the 20th century were women, and then it became this elite male affair because it became associated as a virtuosic art that like it became associated with status and competition. Yeah. And so you see this in the way that I, as a scientific communicator, have always struggled against anxiety among scientists to preserve the rigor of their work by mathematizing it, which makes it illegible. And so there's like an inherent conflict that I see playing out in issues as serious as, for instance, the global climate, where status games of the political and the academic world are in conflict with our ability to actually communicate with one another and come together and actually solve problems from diverse perspectives. And so, yeah, I think where I want to lead you in this is you take a very broad definition of software and of simulation and of representation, and how we keep bumping up against this problem, which is that there are ways that abstraction allows us to operate on systems, allows us to make sense of them, but that, as you put it, at a moment when ever more of our world is devoured by obscure computational processes, that the issue with SimCity that you bring up again and again is that the way that it actually came out was not what got Will Wright to enjoy building it in the first place, that he built it out of the game editor for another game, and he was able to play with the rules. And then by the time it actually makes it out there are all of these substrata that players have very little ability to observe or to operate on. And that everything, everywhere we look, it's true of, even I just read this thing last night by Mark Humphreys in The Transmitter about how neuroscientists can't even read neuroscience papers anymore because they're like 100 pages long. And so we have a profound mismatch between information production and the expertise required to make sense of that and our ability to bring our attention to those and to render them legible and transparent. And yeah, take that where you will.
I'm just thinking, the thing that I'm immediately thinking about is how that one of Bush's goal was designing the MEMX. And then in the 1940s, when he was thinking about it, I think also in the late 30s, already at that point, he was overwhelmed with how much scientific specialization there was and how much he wanted to create a tool that would help people navigate it. And that problem has only gotten worse. Yeah, but I love the shade that James Clerk Maxwell throws to the symbolic, the pale, tenuous, sort of the paleness of a symbolic equation. Like, these are people that really love to think with their hands and think with things. And to me, that was the most striking sort of part of what I loved about finding that material, was this sort of lost world that precedes ours, that gave rise to the digital computer. This machine that really uplifts symbolic abstraction to new heights is predicated on the work of people that were really in these scientific, logical ideas with their hands and their bodies. Bush talked about, I think at one point he says something like, he talked about a barnyard understanding of engineering, right? Of like, that's how he really wanted people to learn. He's like, yeah, the math is fine, the symbolics is fine, but this was a culture that really treasured thinking graphically, and then also thinking with objects and systems that people can manipulate. And this is a point that I came across reading the work of this historian, Larry Owens, who talks about the engineering culture that produced Bush and how graphics were so important to them. And I think about that a lot now, actually, with how, like, I have my wife and I have friends whose grandfathers were draftsmen, people who, for a living, they produced the technical illustrations that so much of the world needed. And that is a category of labor that has disappeared. But we still have more graphics in a sense than ever before. But it feels like it's always in tension with the status of abstract, right? So let me just back up a little bit. Computer graphics, the sort of prevalence of computer graphics, the ease with which we can create computer graphics and how graphics are integrated to other tools that we use on computers means that many more people can produce graphics. You do not need a specialist. You do not need, just like you do not need, they're not really secretaries anymore that sit around and type things up for people. People now, that labor has been reorganized. And I just think about the loss of that graphical skill. It is not as prevalent as now as it was back then. Or maybe it's also more diffusely distributed because maybe more people grow up making illustrations on computers. I don't know. But that is to me is a very interesting, another example of that turn towards that abstraction.
The funny thing is that you do this in the book, you play with this paradox, which is that even as symbolic representation makes certain things more opaque, it makes other things more obvious. I'm playing around a lot with the encouragement of grow your own bespoke language models. I had a friend who trained a model on the Future Fossils podcast corpus earlier this year. And then suddenly, because you talk about how SimCity comes out of this Jay Forrester systems dynamics and this systems move to urban planning that is in some way, if not directly caused by, at least associated with the ability to see a city from the air, right? Like to see it through a window that later becomes the screen through which we interact with the simulation. And that scalar shift is now possible not just through the telescope and the microscope, but through the models that we make of the vector space and the embeddings in that vector space of anything we choose. And so now we can say, you know what, I want to see the patterns in all of the Slack communications I'm having at work. Years ago, when I talked to Lauren Klein about data feminism and her work to identify the origins of certain ideas in the abolitionist papers by the female authors and editors of those papers who were delegating their authorship to men so that it would actually be heard. And now, as historians, we can trace back and say, oh, wow, like that's like this is where the good ideas are actually coming from. And there's a way that we can do this in our own lives that I find really empowering and hopeful if we don't fall into the mirror, if we don't assume that these abstractions are the only way. And so that's why, again, like I appreciate how one of the main characteristics that you keep pointing to with SimCity is the ability to look at multiple maps and understand the relationship between multiple maps, and so this fostering of multiple perspectives on a single object or process.
Yeah, I think it's that, and I think it's also Godzilla. I think it's the monster in SimCity. The playfulness of it also reminds us that this is not real. So, by the way, I love how you like that. Like, I think about that image of the thick glass of looking through an airplane window to the looking through the glass once upon a time of the computer screen to the city. That's totally it. But I think that it's like to not lose track of that they're equivalent, that one is the abstraction of the other, that you can use the LLM. It's a really powerful tool. But what it tells you, you need to approach it with the right skepticism. It is not real. And I think that kind of I think some of the most exciting and dangerous ideas that I point to in the book come from when people sort of flirt with this boundary and sort of losing track of the boundary of their model, of what is the pretend of this model, this equation, this simulation represents some other thing. And I think about how there was someone running for in the November election, there was a local candidate running for office who I was reading an interview with them, and they talked about, the journalist was pushing them on one of their claims, and they said, yeah, well, I asked ChatGPT and it said da 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 da. And I was like, oh, this person, I'm definitely voting for not this person. Because this person is just taking at face value what the system, it puts on the appearance of an intelligent conversational partner, but you need to approach it with the right skepticism, you need to remember that this is not real.
You point that out in the belief that we live in a simulation pointedly illustrates the hazards of analogical collapse. And yet, you quote Stephen Levy's Exploring the Nature of Simulation versus Reality, where he says, as simulations veined with biases, Levy noted, run on government computers to help determine national policy. His real interest in simulation was ontological, quote, not what they profess to address, but the separate realities they generate. So it's, yeah, okay, we're not living in a simulation, but we're living in multiple competing and collaborating simulations. Like, this is the complexity economics. And I find this really important. One of the things that comes up in the show a lot is the way that, like, I was just talking with Ben Mathis on Twitter about this claim that, like, financial success in December of 2024 seems to be determined, like a correlate of one's proximity to Elon Musk, that like he has mastered this story weaving. And if you go back, like NPR did a really good episode a few years ago on post-truth and on Putin and Trump and the way that their advisors realized that ground truthing things did not matter and that they were able to manipulate narrative. And so we live in this world of like fifth generation warfare, which is about which stories end up governing human behavior. And there's like a way that, as I think about this, is like, well, what simulation are we unwittingly living in? And, you know, you keep talking about the critiques of SimCity being that it doesn't make its assumptions obvious, that Alan Kay said that SimCity is technically impressive, but not good enough for children because its rules should be exposed so kids can see and change them. That good learning environments, Kay argues, make contexts visible, make them objects of discourse, make them explicitly reshapable and inventable. And so, yeah, I feel like the question I asked you about play earlier could be and understood as a question about how do we incent, maybe we don't have to try, like maybe just living in a crazier, more volatile and in some sense like unpredictable world because of all of the complexity generated by our efforts to understand it creates an evolutionary imperative to make these processes more legible, to get our hands on them in a more obvious way.
Yeah, it's just like the thing. It's the legibility and it's the silliness that reminds us that it's play. I'm just thinking about Burning Man and sort of the experience of, what that does. It does many things, but one of the things that it does is it reminds you of how arbitrary human civilization is. You see just how sort of it's like there it is. It's all just there's really not much here in the playa, and then there's just all this infrastructure built up in this social world, and it's a more legible, complete social world in a sense. You see the inputs and outputs, and sort of the whimsical nature of it reminds you of how it's all sort of made up, and not something we should take for granted.
You actually start this book with a quote from the myth of Krishna and Yoshada, where you say in here, "For God's power of delusion inspires in me such false beliefs as I exist. This is my husband. This is my son." And
Yeah.
you go on and you say other stuff, but I was like, that's a bold way to start this.
I mean, that was originally in the middle of the book. I was sort of reaching my climax with cellular automata and that reality confusion that they have instilled to people so many times, where some people think, oh, we're living in a cellular automata. The world is a CA. And then I realized it doesn't fit. I need to end this chapter differently. But that theme, that myth, felt like it really was a good framing for thinking about the seductive power of simulation to confuse and mislead us. And it's also sort of inescapable. Like our consciousness is always embedded in some system. So our sense of who we are and where we are is always constructed in some way, even if it's materially grounded. And that image of Yashoda looking into the mouth of Krishna opens, the story is that fragment of it is that her son, Krishna, eats some dirt, and she says, oh, yeah, you've eaten some dirt? Open your mouth and show me. It's just like my kid puts a rock in his mouth, it's like a wood chip in his mouth. Open your mouth. Let me get that wood chip out. I don't eat that. And he opens his mouth, and he plays a trick on her, and she looks in his mouth, and she sees the whole universe, and she sees this orb in the middle. That's Earth, and then she sees herself on it. So she has this whole kind of this psychedelic experience looking into this god's mouth who tricks her, and then she loses track of who she even is in that moment. And then his mouth closes, and then she's returned to her prior sense of self. The translator I'm blanking on her name right now, but there's this amazing Sanskrit scholar who's produced that translation, writes a lot about this stuff. And she points out that this is like a common motif in a lot of Hindu stories or Sanskrit stories. And it's the women forget when they come out, but the men come out, there's a gender thing. The men come out and they sort of leave with some new sort of transcendent knowledge. So there's a kind of gender bias in these stories too.
It's funny. At the same time, I've been reading your book. I've been reading Scale Theory, a non-disciplinary inquiry by Joshua DiCaglio. And he talks about the difference between the performative objectivity of the view from nowhere of modernist science and the mystical view from nowhere of like Ed Mitchell and Rusty Schweikart being over the planet, seeing down, and that there's this thing about seeing the world as very small, that there's a scalar shift, but that at the same time, the ship in a bottle experience of the earth, it does something to people that triggers mystical experience and makes them realize just how profoundly vulnerable and fragile and precious it is. And there's that thing of, again, something like that is going on in the process of simulation and of the analog. I just read a little bit because it's funny, because this actually goes way back to before modern computing. He says, this trope has a deep history prior to space travel. We can, as an introductory comparison, sample two additional examples. In her showings, Julian of Norwich experienced a noticeably scalar vision. Quote, and in this vision, he showed me a little thing the size of a hazelnut lying in the palm of my hand. And to my mind's eye, it was as round as any ball. And I looked at it and thought, what can this be? And the answer came to me, it is all that is made. End quote. The change created by this vision is written now as the result of a limited human perspective. Quote, this is why those who choose to occupy themselves with earthly business and are always pursuing worldly success have nothing here of God in their hearts and souls, because they love and seek their rest in this little thing. And then also references Arjuna encountering the true form of Krishna. There Arjuna beheld the entire universe as one, divided in many ways in the God of gods. And so there's this weird like universe in a nutshell thing that you connect to right drawing inspiration from the Siberiad by Stanislaw Lem. And I would love to hear you just introduce this, because I had no idea of this story. And it's so funny that there is this weird mystical thing that stretches all the way back through the roots of simulation software and science fiction, and us wrestling with the kind of question that Chris Langton wrestled with when he was working on artificial life and freaked out. He's in some documentary I saw years ago saying basically he was worried that if he pulled the plug on the simulation, he was committing genocide.
Yeah, that's a great. I'm very curious about that book. I think I've come across that author before. I mean, these are theological questions. I think is what I think that's kind of that's one of the connections here. The Stanislaw Lem story, I think it's the Seventh Sally, it's a great story. So Stanislaw Lem is a very celebrated Polish science fiction author. It's from a collection of stories that I highly recommend. And it's these two inventor constructors. I think that they're robots. It may not be exactly clear from the book, but they kind of romp around the universe. It's a pretty whimsical sci-fi. I think it's kind of Douglas Adams-ish in some sense. In the Seventh Sally, which is one of the stories, they debate this question about whether or not it's right for them to have made this simulation for this tyrant to rule over. It's also a debate for them about whether or not they themselves experience emotions and feelings and the reality of their own experience. And there's a line in there where they compare their own consciousness to just electrons moving about, the play of electrons. It's just mechanism, right? There's no suffering here. So this wrestling with the morality of the simulated world also leads them to wrestle with their own sort of the question of consciousness more generally. And I think at the end of the story, the king I think he may be deposed. Does his new simulated world, I think it bleeds out of the box that they make for him and it sort of takes over. And I think maybe he's deposed again. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was, as you say here, that's actually where I wanted to take this. You say, returning to the asteroid, Lem's protagonists are relieved and stunned to find that the simulated society has overflowed the box, banished the king, and enveloped the asteroid in countless signs of intelligent life. That's a singularity. And then later...
And an overview.
And then later you're talking about how they say all along Wright had wanted to share with players the joy of shaping the rules of the world. The Sims extensible architecture was cultivated from early on with an eye toward player modding, not merely milking the franchise with expansion after expansion. Not long after launch, he collaborated with Ken Forbes, a professor of computer science and education, on a game design course that put the Sims' internal development tools in the hands of students. Did Wright secretly hope that these tools would escape into the wild? Maybe, Forbes told me, but the students respected Wright too much to do that. While Wright would have been happy for them to release it into the wild, and Electronic Arts did release some tools he learned from Forbes' class, supporting them was simply too much work. In any event, doing so would have risked upsetting the authorial balance of power, and alongside it, the lucrative expansion pack business Braun had once dreamt of. So there it is again. It's like one of the themes in this show is the parent and child relationship that we have to technology. And this question of whether it's fair or right. I mean, on some level, it's obvious that no one has the compute necessary. No inventor can intend for every possible use of their tool. And that really good inventors like Wright know this and lean into it. And yet we still enshrine the sort of genius inventor. We defend IP. It's like a Saturn eating his children motif that keeps coming up again and again because of this collision between the inconsequential world of SimCity, in which you can just bulldoze things for fun, and the consequential world in which you can't open source the software because then you lose your revenue model. And so if I look back again to the way that institutions have to play this kind of fan dance of proprietary knowledge in order to secure status and resources, the question of how do we encourage play in individuals is also a question of, and I think we've already answered this, but I'd love to hear you reflect on it one more time. Kind of shockingly, one of the world's greatest proponents of open source software has become Mark Zuckerberg, right? And it's like, okay, well, how much of that has to do with the fact that he knows he can basically leverage the creative activity of all of those little invisible people in the city that he's playing to generate new wealth for him, and how much of it is out of an expanded sense of self that open sourcing something actually does provision public goods.
It's hard for me to read. I'm not deeply familiar with this thinking on it or what he said, but it's hard for me to read it not as simply self-interested. Just it's a way for Meta to put its thumb in the eye of Google and OpenAI and others and trying to sort of maintain some balance of power, right? Like they're behind, so they're going to try to give everyone else a boost so that, so that it's not winner take all. Just like OpenAI originally, you read there was this amazing document they were released as part of this court case you could see the correspondence between Elon Musk and Sam Altman talking about founding OpenAI, and OpenAI had the name Open in it, and that was for a reason. They had their own selfish interests as well as who knows exactly what the balance is of public serving versus selfish. But I think that there's always that balance. I think the nonprofits, they're playing a different game than it's a related game, but they're playing a different game than like a big publicly traded company, I think.
Let's make a toy here, right? You're a parent, I'm a parent. The question of agency that I'm pursuing in this program becomes very tangible and concrete when we ask, how do we create the structure for our children to learn from our mistakes in a safe environment and yet still afford them the ability to make their own decisions? And when it comes to, like, you talk a lot about Kevin Kelly and Stuart Brand and the whole earth dimension of this through citing Fred Turner's From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And there is this thing that comes up again and again, Kevin Kelly's Out of Control, about how the more lifelike technology becomes, the more we are raising it rather than controlling it. And Decay, who wrote the machine translation algorithm that ended up in becoming the substrate of Google Translate and everything. He's coming out with a book also from MIT Press on raising AI. So this is a very real thing. It's like, how do we assume accountability for the raptors that have escaped Jurassic Park while still treating them as animals rather than simply corporate assets?
That's interesting. I mean, I'm still I think my gut response is, are they really children? Do we? Because I'm thinking because Out of Control was written in the published, I think 94, 93 is when it came out. So it's like, at that time, was there really any technology that we could relate to as parents? Like how much of that was a sort of projection or wishful thinking at the time? But it's easier to buy now, that kind of thinking. But Google's machine translation, pre-LLMs, I don't know. It seems like a bit of a stretch. I'm not familiar with the technology, but the LLMs, I see it more in there was a great This American Life where it was about the producer talked to some writers who had access to a very early version of what became ChatGPT. It was called Da Vinci something. It was a coding assistant, and they were at some wedding, and the OpenAI employee showing it off to his writer friends, and he was like, "You guys got to check this out." And that version of the software had far fewer guardrails on it, and it was a really interesting article, a really interesting piece to learn about how that system had so much more personality. So like now you interact with these LLMs, and they have these kind of vague, like waiter-like personalities. They're just kind of like, "Oh, how can I help you, master?" Like this kind of like polite genie, like it's just so. And I've sort of prompted the one that I use to work on a game with to be a little bit more playful with me, which suits me. It's almost like maybe what I'm getting into is less about how we parent. I'm seeing it less in terms of how we parent the technology, but more about how we're parenting all the people who are going to adopt it, right? Because we're creating these persona that people are then going to adopt, like me and you, and one day our kids, perhaps your kids already. And I sort of think about what orientation do we want them to have to this technology? Do we want them to think that it's sort of this sort of bland waiter, wish-fulfilling machine? Do we try to design the AI technology to have a certain kind of personality or stance?
You thank Sam Arbusman in your acknowledgments. And, Sam, and I'm sure you and Sam have talked about his own writing on computing and magic and many other people's invocation of the golem, right? It was like the question of, if we're going to keep referencing the genies and the golems and mythical entities that we seem to have concretized through AI. Timothy Morton talked about this too in Future Fossils 223, that there is something deeply problematic with the reification of the master-slave dynamic that goes all the way back to the original use of the word robot. So there's like there's a flaw in our own code as it were, that persists into what is ostensibly a liberal and democratic era where, again, when you were quoting Leibniz and others who were saying basically like it's not fair to have to make scientists sit here and perform these computations like a slave or
No, he
whatever he
says
said.
that. Yeah, I think that's the translation. Yeah, it's not fair to make us labor like slaves over our calculations. And of course, there was a lot of women involved too that did these calculations like for behalf. Yeah.
Yeah. So the big thing is, okay, maybe not child, but if we are domesticating ourselves with our built environments and we are domesticating the wilderness of evolutionary possibility by bringing it down into form as technology, how do we adopt a kind of Donna Haraway kinship framework with these things, even if we don't wish to identify them as agencies? Like, this is like one of the more radical turns in Tim Morton's stuff is that they want to give a kind of dignity to the inanimate world because we are ourselves objects and we are strange to ourselves, that we are other in a way that everything else is other. And so
I'm really down with the more than human world way of looking at the world, and that there's a lot of stuff out there like us that is worthy of respect and consideration and kinship. That we are just living matter, right? But I'm thinking about the doomer AI scenarios, right? Bostrom's like paperclip thought experiment. What if we have an AI that's told to go make lots of paperclips and it just turns the whole world into a giant paperclip making machine and decides that getting rid of people is the right thing to do? I think that the ethical problem that I have with that stance is that it ascribes too much agency to these things that are really extensions of human agency. I think that part of the seductiveness of that story, right? I think like the goal, whether it's the golem or whatever, the genie, whatever narrative story, whatever we're mapping this to, they're all serving a different purpose for us. These different metaphors. I think the problem that I have with this ascribing too much agency to the AIs, I think that it serves a purpose for people who want to hide the fact that the AIs are extensions of their agency. So when Sam Altman runs around screaming about, actually he's not really one of these doomers, but he's benefited from the affiliation with the AI doomers.
We can't release the source code. It might destroy everything.
Yeah. I think that is really just it's a magic trick. It's misdirecting attention from the fact that it is a very concrete extension of some very powerful people's agency. And I think that misdirection is sort of, it successfully deflects attention from the fact that these AIs are extensions of particular individuals and communities' worldviews and interests. So I'm more interested in how I think you put it something like, I think you said it something like how we shape the technology so then then domesticating us. How we shape our built environment that is then domesticating us. I think that's the part that I would focus on.
I guess the last piece that I want to tie into this is in talking about the origins of system dynamics and Jay Forrester's early work on modeling cities that became the top-down of urban development that Will Wright folds into SimCity, and your contrast with like Schelling's work on segregation and Conway's Game of Life and these other bottom-up approaches. You mentioned many times, well, both SimCity exists in this sort of limbo, this isolation, that you can grow indefinitely into an environment in which it's not an MMORPG. It's you in a kind of godlike bubble world. And that Jay Forrester's urban environment has that thing where it expands limitlessly into an environment into which the export of externalities is not part of the modeling of that world. And I think this is the most consequential aspect of what we choose to reveal or unwittingly reveal and conceal through our abstractions. I think a lot about all of the hate crime, like all of the ways that our efforts to categorize the world can be understood sympathetically as people only have so much attention. There's a cognitive horizon over which you cannot really engage every experience of your life as truly singular and novel. And that shows up in our economic calculus, not necessarily through any kind of malevolent action, but through an inability to fully account for everything that we're pushing out onto other people or to the ecological systems upon which we depend or onto our own future generations. And there's this weird flywheel thing that goes on with the history of computing where we keep trying to fold more and more into the computation to account for more of that. But I remember hearing a physicist at SFI talking about how actually you can extract information from a black hole. It would just take a computer larger than the universe, So it's like, well, you can model the entire Earth, but it's going to take expanding beyond Earth in order to do it, and recruiting all of those latent wealth troves in the asteroid belt and transforming the Earth in the process. And so really, like, my last question for you is about, when is enough enough? How do we accept the constraints on our ability to understand? And how do we make peace with the fact no model is ever adequate?
I'm like, as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about that image about the map that's so detailed, but the map becomes one-to-one with the territory, right? It's like we need a computer the size of the whole universe to extract information from the black hole. I think that's a great point. I'm just thinking about how for these models to be useful, something is always left out. And if you can't include everything, it's just not cognitively possible. It's not computationally possible. So those are choices that we make about what to leave in and what to leave out. And better that we are, as Alan Kay points out, better that we're forthcoming about about the model's design. And this was Forrester's point too, that people should be able to see and construct the models themselves, so they're not misled by them, right? Yeah. As a game designer, I just think about it's all about that abstraction, right? It's to make something that is understandable and playable and not sort of impossible to build. You have to abstract. That's the art.
You put it really well at the end of chapter 8. You say, according to Wright, quote, there are certain things we just cannot simulate on a computer, but on the other hand, that people are very good at simulating in their heads. So we just take that part of the simulation and offload it from the computer into the player's head, end quote. SimCity's most powerful simulation component isn't inside the computer. It's the player's imagination. So we're kind of back where we started. Really, this is about not getting lost in the sauce. It's about recognizing that, as you put it, SimCity functions as a partner in play, or that our technologies can provoke our imagination rather than to replace it. I just want to give you the opportunity to close this out by offering, as a game designer and as a scholar of simulation, if you were to suggest some kind of disposition or attitude or meta strategy for listeners about what you think the best possible future would be. It's one in which people interact with technology in what way?
I feel like I'm sort of next token predicting here, but I feel like I think like it would be about imagination. It would be about opening up rather than closing down human imagination. It would be about encouraging playfulness, and I think a sort of an equitable flourishing across human beings, but also beyond the world that we're part of more broadly.
Well, Chaim, this has been super fun. I chose to leave some things out of this abstraction. Do you have a bonus round? Because I just personally, a few minutes here before your contractor arrives. It's funny because I think I talked to you about how I know some of the people that were involved with Biosphere 2.
Oh, wow.
And you bring up Biosphere 2 in this as another analog simulation of the biosphere. And the thing that strikes me about that is that project was profoundly misrepresented in the media. And I think that the reason is that it was built with the kind of ethic of open-ended exploration, of simulation, of discovery that motivated SimCity. But when it became a worldwide news phenomenon in the early 90s, it was interpreted through the lens of game shows and a pass fail.
Yeah.
And so when they realized they were generating too much carbon dioxide and they had to open the enclosure, that everyone inside of Biosphere 2 debated it really fiercely because they knew that they were going to be losing a game. That in the design of this thing, they intended for it to run 50 successive enclosure experiments over a century, and that they were going to learn something every time, and that there's this profound mismatch. People are taught science as though you can have a failed experiment. And the consequence for them was that it was taken from them because it had been funded by oil money, and then the Bass oil fortune decided that they didn't want it reflecting poorly on them. And so they brought Steve Bannon in, who was, the like hostile takeover
Do we
guy.
know?
And
Is it publicly known exactly what happened behind the scenes? Because Bass had been. My understanding is that their patron, the Bass patron, had been funding their work for, I think, decades already at that point, and this was, I think, the biggest.
yeah, he was
project.
the son of the family.
So was it that? Was this because it's also, it feels, this is speculation on my part, but it feels like not a coincidence that this is happening in a moment of dawning awareness about the climate crisis, and there's sort of like a, I could speculate that there's a kind of like, we're going to pull the rug out from under this because this is potentially hitting too close to home. But I hadn't considered the possibility that it was an embarrassment to the family, which also makes a lot of sense too.
Well, yeah, the problem was, as I understand it, from like Mark Nelson, who was in that group of biospherians, and from John Allen at the Institute of Ecotechnics. And they talk about this a little bit in Spaceship Earth, in the documentary that was made about it.
I love that.
That the problem was that none of the people okay, so we didn't ever get to Fred Turner's Network Forum and the notion that Will Wright acted as a kind of intellectual broker between all of these disparate communities of thought and practice. And that's what John Allen was. And that John Allen, in the design of Biosphere 2, brought together just some engineers in the 80s at a time when these two groups hated and distrusted each other, workshops where he was able to organize interdisciplinary collaboration for this project, and basically brought in all of the prestige and credentials and expertise, but that the people in the Institute of Ecotechnics were an art collective, like they were a commune.
The theater
group. And so when it started producing unintended consequences, the Bass oil family looked at this as, oh shit, these people aren't even scientists. And so they suffered precisely the way that Will Wright succeeded by receiving a kind of unintentional honorary doctorate from Nintendo and SFI. He had demonstrated his expertise by making it legible. But yeah, I think that's what ultimately happened, is that the play crashed up against the risk that the oil money lives in, that like risk space of, we cannot be associated with a bunch of weirdo psychedelic theater dilettantes running this thing.
Yeah, like it makes you wonder. So perhaps if Biosphere 2 had been less of a media phenomenon, they would have been fine with it. If it had gone sideways in its media representation at a smaller scale, it would have not registered for them, perhaps. But then perhaps they needed that media scale to gather the resources they needed to do the project, whether they're financial and otherwise.
I think that they would have been fine without it, and that they were victims of their own success.
Yeah.
That they were just very proud of what they did.
I mean, there's a moment in that. So part of what's interesting about that example too is how profoundly playful that whole community that created Biosphere 2 was. That it was they called themselves, I think, was it the Theater of All Possibilities or something like that? Just really, really interesting. And the documentary, which is just really incredible, Spaceship Earth, I think it's really just fantastic. You see them building the ship from scratch that they launch in the San Francisco Bay, and they sail across the world, I think. It's just unreal. They teach themselves shipbuilding, and they do that. And so by the time it comes to do Biosphere 2, they're like, yeah, of course we can just figure this out. And then you see the same people, individuals. I have this vivid image of these women sort of remaking themselves in these like powerful 90s, late 80s media presentations that they go on this like global media blitz. It's just incredible. They just kind of take it on. It's just like a make-believe theater project for them, but just like everything is.
I love these people, and so I don't mean to indict them, but I think it's a risk that all of us run, which is this question of, well, just how much do you need to be seen? Like, how much do you really need to court power in order to do this? Like, Xerox PARC seemed to have worked so well because they could fail and fail and fail as long as every once in a while they coughed up something like a laser printer. Otherwise they were just sort of left to be weirdos and do their thing.
Yeah, though many people consider Xerox PARC to have been a failure because of Xerox's inability to commercialize the GUI, though in a sense they did by investing in Apple and giving them the goods.
Yeah, we're all being surveilled and judged by the future. And sorry, everyone. Sorry for being so legible to you. Anyway, Chaim, this is awesome. I really hope that this is just the beginning of some lively network forum collaboration.
Totally. It's great to connect with you and chat and do this. I remember I have a memory of meeting you in Santa Fe at an SFI event once, and then just kind of mostly I was like, what is this strange world that I'm inside of right now?
I didn't know either. That was before my involvement. I was a tadpole. When I was still young and naive in the theater of all possibilities.
Yeah.
Anyway. Thanks again for listening. Humans on the Loop is a listener-supported project committed to helping us dream better together. If you liked this episode, dig into the archives and learn more about the perks of membership at humansontheloop.com, where you can find show notes with extensive citations, our interactive knowledge graph, and a link to the Wisdom and Technology Discord server. Our next dialogue is with pioneering digital media artist, documentarian, and brand strategist Taryn Southern about lessons from her career at the edge of emerging technologies and our evolving exploration of what it means to be human. Stay tuned, and remember, imagination is our greatest natural resource.